got a pretty good head massage from the guy while he was putting this on, so yeah, all fresh and ready to go. Something's happening here, which is, one second, is it? Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, great. So, if you look at the title of the lecture, and Kavita forced me to put together a title, and I had to just, find something, and the title Subjective Processes basically speaks of an interrogation today within the practice to kind of find a balance. It's a very fragile space between what we like to call the intellectual, which is something that is learned, accumulated intelligence, past knowledge, empirical knowledge in a sense, and then something which is a little more ineffable, more inexpressible, which we like to call intuition. We respect the rational processes, the linear, iterative process, the rigor in the analysis that necessitates the final product and the journey as well. But I've always believed in the primacy of the human mind more than any process or restrictive framework, to be able to absorb information at an alarming rate and swivel the whole thing around and assimilate and extrapolate in new and wonderful ways. And Mr. Ganju, I think you summed it up perfectly when you spoke of freedom of the imagination. And what we're trying to do is basically be free and to be agile and reflexive in our work and not get tied down. And so what I'm going to do is essentially look at 3 projects, varying levels of development, some partially completed, some nearing completion, and something that's underway right now. It's just very recent, to try and illustrate how this balance keeps changing as the context changes and what actually comes of it. This is a project actually very close by. It's a 500 square yard plot in South Extension 2, and those were some of the initial sketches of the project. And before I actually get into it, I haven't personally spent too much time in Delhi, but Dad, he grew up here, and he always talked about the fact that homes in Delhi in the winter and the quality of light, and they were kind of grim and dreary, and that kind of stuck with me. And seeing what's been happening recently, if you just look at there is an arrow up there, and we look at how South Extension 2 is a very traditional colony in terms of having a subarterial road. It's always filled with cars, and this is what it used to be, with ground plus 1 structures, set back from the road, trees providing privacy, providing some sort of urban buffer, and essentially a lower urban footprint. There wasn't so much impact on the street. The houses were hidden. There was some contact with nature. There was a garden you could walk through that you could enjoy as part of your home. And if you look at the next set of sections over here, this is what our planning authorities have now done to the city, where they've increased the areas. They've commissioned these stilt plus 4 4-level buildings, and you can just see the impact they've had in terms of the setbacks reducing, balconies projecting further out, these buildings overhanging on the street, trees being cut, no garden, no urban porosity, no relationship to the street. And that stilt for me is a horrible space, because it doesn't matter what you do within the building on top, but you're always entering through this horrible 7 and 8 foot dark, dingy space. You can coat it in gold and silver, but it fundamentally lacks quality and character. So we really began to address 3 basic issues. One is the urban impact of the building, from the street, from within and without, the urban porosity of the building, the reinstatement of the garden and nature becoming the focal point of the house, and the quality of light that could be mediated through summer and winter to keep the same quality through the space throughout. And you can start to see some of the basic sections that develop. And we had a very, very hard time with the authorities, because we just cut away a part of the stilt and told them that we're reducing the footprint of the building, but they argued that no, you have to have the stilt. And I said, my friend, I'm building less, I'm putting trees in there, reducing the heat island effect. But anyway, they still might insist on us putting that steel stilt back there. But it's essentially for a family of lawyers. They have their offices in the basement, and the first floor level, and the rest are their living spaces. And that kind of that street aspect, I hope is clear up there. So you can see to the left, you have the older kind of structure, and this is actually what's happening either side of our site. The older structure with the G+1, a partial Barsati, and then to the right, someone's redeveloped that plot and they've got this horrific building just hanging over the street. And we've tried to look at some interpretation right there in the center where we can start to set back from the street. We had a wonderful large tree here. This is the north, and we had this wonderful tree over here, and we had a line of Ashoka trees on the inside, and then another large tree out here in the road. So by eliminating the stilt space, we actually established a huge amount of urban porosity by also opening up the compound wall and allowing the vision to flow right through the space. It percolates on the underside of the building, and that's something that we've been interrogating as well in terms of the spaces that can develop beneath buildings with large volumes to bring the gardens back, to bring the light back. And we start to see how internal sections develop with the stilt flowing right through. That's the street over there, and with a little cut in the compound wall. So even when you're walking past, you don't really perceive a heavily built form because the parts that actually project out close to the boundary are hidden behind trees. Even where we develop the common living areas, you have large double height terraces opening out into the north, which then start to set back. Your glazing is protected. So somewhere we start to pull this building back off the street. We're able to articulate the basement courtyard that starts to run up through there. And I think this is a very, very typical gesture of some of the newer standalone homes in Delhi with the central courtyard. But that also creates a typology of space where we essentially create a front and back of the house. And we started to investigate the throughput of the lower space of seeing space moving right through, of trying to find the same vocabulary moving through the upper levels. So instead of having a front and back, you have spaces that push right through the house. So even though it's a 500 square yard plot, you see this immense expanse that connects right through, and we're fortunate to have trees in the front and the back. And then, auxiliary terraces develop there on top, and they're probably going to fit an apartment floor at some point there. That kind of shows you a longitudinal section through the space of, we start with the courtyard down in the basement. It develops a large porous stilt level. These are the main living spaces that start to extend right through the center of the building, and then these courtyards start to extend upwards, forming a terrace out there in the west. The whole point is these courtyards also become active climatic devices because they bring light in through very tiny fissures, but they also act as thermal controls because air then starts to vent through stack effects, working differently in summer and winter, where in summer all they have to do is leave a couple of doors and windows open as strategic points within this courtyard, and in winter they simply close it up and start to hotbox it to retain heat. A basic volumetric analysis of the space with the stilt cut away, the courtyard that starts at the basement and then starts to navigate its way through the building. This little point here, which is, I don't know if you can see the labeling of light court, but we split the building and the house in the south to allow these very narrow fissures of light. And the transmission of light through the space became very important in terms of where we could get in large light that flows through, as well as narrow fissures where the building starts to part through the volumes and through the structure. That was an initial render of the space. We've also used a lot of operable jolly systems. I do mention Ambrish on this one because he helped us with some of the technical detailing of the operable screens. But again, when we talk about a certain reflexivity, there's a reason why a line starts to do that, because this double height terrace, which is where the living room opens out onto, starts to open to the northwest, where they have a very large tree. The private spaces, the bedrooms, have buffer jollies and then terraces before you actually have the glazing. So you can start to look at large glazings, but coming into very deeply shaded and protected spaces. We can also let the quality of light and privacy be manually operated through the space. And a little, I suppose, hark out to the strong modernist language that is prevalent in Delhi. And the entire building actually supports on a central circulation core and this gigantic 30-foot tall concrete pylon. And it just operates on these two cores. And it just completely emancipates ground floor space that then percolates downwards into the basement and upwards through the building. I'm not going to dwell too much on these, but this is just towards the entrance of the plot where you start to see the stilt space, the tree growing through the basement, the garden that then starts to push into the house. So somewhere you resurrect the sensation of nature reverberating through the space. Again, a strong structural vocabulary, which is in a sense endemic to Delhi. And these are some of the construction charts. You can see the light wells that start to develop through the center of the house. The material palette is simply with raw exposed concrete with the waffles and the piers and the shear walls, and then working with mint stones. Yeah, some more. And it's a wonderful quality of light that starts to happen in the evening. It's looking back out towards, so you start to look out towards the trees. The space is about 18 feet tall. That pier that extends downwards into the basement, perforates into the west. Yeah, and that's what we have at site currently. I suppose once the barricades come down, we can fully start to appreciate the view of the trees and how you kind of buffer yourself from the urban environment outside. Some of the internal spaces. So something very interesting happened here, and both the structural engineer and the contractor have been cursing me throughout the project, because not only are there longitudinal shifts in the volumes, but there are also lateral shifts, which means spaces start to cut away from their boundary walls to start to introduce north lights into the living spaces. So even when you're within, in a sense, a partially stratified environment, you get the sense of sky above you, you get the north light streaming in, because as you get into the central depth of the space, you start to draw light in from the courtyard, but you also start to draw it in through north lights. And the quality of light, whether it's diffused or it's contrast light, that keeps changing through the space. And you can see the proportions of the pier over there. So there's also a very strong duality in terms of the scale that develops in the project, from at parts being almost monumental, then developing as very intimate spaces. That's some of the images of the living room. You can start to see the image to the left and above, how the north light, and that north light actually slopes down to actually orient towards the north, and you have the trees outside, the terrace beyond. The den starts to cantilever over to start to shade the glazing into these double height spaces. And looking back again with the north light, and you see the fundamental idea of redrawing the typology of the front and back by connecting right through the space. So you get these apertures at both ends, light filters in through the center. Yeah, it just kind of moves right through, and those skylights cut into the upper deck are quite interesting because they bring light into the center of the house, and they also allow these beautiful images. I was there on site recently. I'm not sure if you can see on the left one, kind of the half crescent moon over there, but I think it's important to, when you're within the space, to always somewhere connect back to nature, because all the processes we talk about, I think they're best illustrated through natural processes and through the movement of light through the space. And one of the upper level courtyards. And that's where the fissure to the south, where the building starts to part, and you get these wonderful views to the trees beyond, and you get very deep shaded glasses, so light percolates deep into the house. And then we go back into the basement. Again, it's very, very monolithic in its quality. Yeah, that's Mr. Tiwari, the site foreman. He never really looks happy, because this has been it's been a difficult time for him to put this one together. And yeah, again, just the simple quality of the materials, just raw concrete, and the way little slits of light bring light through those spaces. And then to look at the control of light through the space. So, I mean, the jolly is a very, very traditional element. It works with the breezes, with the Venturi effects. It helps us, control the levels of privacy and light within the space. So we took the traditional patterns and then started to extrapolate contemporary responses to them. And you can see within there that some of them are, contemporary patterns, but you do get some of the traditional Islamic patterns that come back in the jali, and these can be open, closed, left in various positions, so you can modulate the privacy, the light, the visibility throughout. This is a very, very tricky project. It's for a school in Ahmedabad, and kind of before, I'm just going to quickly digress for a moment, because education itself is a very, very complex subject, and again, when we come back to that reconciliation, or that ground between the intellectual and the intuitive, we again come back to learn process versus intuitive processes. And the whole process of education is not being deterministic, but looking at discovery and introspection and collaboration. We had some wonderful, wonderful conversations with a group of very good young educators who are looking at progressive environments for their schools. And we looked at the Bindu as a concept, as the start and the end point of all knowledge, acting centrifugally and centripetally. And obviously, Ahmedabad has a very, very rich history of both traditional and contemporary architecture. It's kind of a loaded subject, trying to work in an educational institution in Ahmedabad with Khan and Doshi, hanging over your head. Yeah, it's a tricky one. So looking at, vernacular responses to the planning of space with the narrow streets, the orientations, looking at the thermal insulation of subterranean spaces. We all know this very well. I think Akshat waxed eloquent about it yesterday, but both in terms of climate control, social interaction, these step wells are wonderful, wonderful devices for the region. And the pole houses, again, anyone been to architecture school would have studied these intimately, and looking at both the plans and the sections in terms of the narrow streets, how they stagger, how they mediate. 15 minutes already? Okay, we need to really fly. I need like 7 minutes more, yeah? Yeah, sorry, man. So I'm going to move straight into it. Okay, so we went to the site, and it's full of these wonderful trees, and I'm not sure if you can see it. I'm going to try and point it out there. But there is a charpa here, and a child has basically tied together plastic bags and made this improvised swing from the branch. And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to education, using nature as the focal point, sympathy to the environment, and necessity-based innovation, this image says it all to us. And somewhere during this process, we finally decided we don't want a building. We're looking at a tool for constructive learning, for discovery, for multiple journeys, multiple paths, and simply translating analogs and metaphors from urban environments, because this is where these kids are going to go back to create these spaces. So to look at where the trees are at the zero level, for example, one of the initial sketches, and we simply picked between the trees, resisted the urge to build on open ground, and modulated the levels in such a way where we developed subterranean spaces, used the tree spaces as zero levels. So your first 2 levels of school would simply be half a level up and down. It makes movement easy. It makes it possible for children to run through the complex and form these beautiful spaces for learning, collaboration, introspection. It's a simple development with the 2 groves of trees. Phase 1 at the bottom, phase 2 at the top. I'm just dealing with phase 1 right now, and the street that connects them. Organically placing blocks within the trees, completely unmediated. At the lower level, almost like the existing foundations of an old settlement. Looking at the more rigid discipline of blocks flying through the tree. So it's really about being under the tree and being within the tree. And these blocks on top almost act as these long span bridges that are like walkways in a nature reserve. So it brings students intimately into contact with nature. Working with the levels, how spaces aggregate around the foundations and settlements, plotting the nodal zones where common spaces, multipurpose activities, and circulation start to link the bottom and the top. So the whole point is we unpack the program and we deconstruct the building to reduce its visual and notional footprint. And that's how it develops 3-dimensionally. You can start to see, I think I'll just get through. Looking at the multipurpose spaces as the interventions that connected upper and lower levels formed around the courtyards. Library spaces that start from the ground, get bermed over so children can basically start from the main quad and simply run up into their classrooms when they need to. The south and west areas completely banked up in subterranean with fissures of light that form courtyards where classrooms open out onto. And that's where we are currently, and looking at some of the materiality for the space. You can see the fissures and how you start to form these deep recessed courtyards, and then these blocks that actually move through the trees like bridges. And in some way, from the eye level, I mean, the whole point was to eliminate a sense of strong built-up mass and take away the monumental and institutional to build a more fluid and flexible framework. I think we've seen a sketch section that just illustrates more of the same. Okay, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. We're still developing a language with some of the weavers in Ahmedabad to look at textile weaving possibly for the facades, and to look at operable facades which students can actually manipulate with gears and levers and pulleys and sandbags and rocks, so they can learn mechanical principles and actually adapt their physical environment to it. That's where you can pretty much run up a grass berm and head into your classroom. So the scale at the central quad, where they have their institutional facilities of their sport facilities, the auditorium, the scale becomes a little bit larger for congregation areas. And then as you start to move into the courtyard, you start to see these organic shaded spaces that start to form within and under and through. So quickly, my last one, Madhav. I need about 2 to 3 minutes. Yeah, so that's, sorry. I think you've seen these images before. That's Tungi Fort, and that's the view from our own home in Pavna. And I think you reach a point, because every project in the practice and in the journey becomes a point in the timeline. It becomes evolutionary, but every once in a while, all that learning and all that experience and all those principles tend to coalesce into a single project. And Dad and I came together for this one, and I think this is where we've come closest to a fruitful collaboration. Intense slopes with the hills at the backdrop, 30, 35 degree slopes. We had these massive ravines that cut through the site, carrying rainwater. We're talking about 50, 60 foot deep ravines that actually carved the site into certain parts, forming ridges and more kind of temperate slopes. We're surrounded by Shivaji's forts. I think both with the materiality and the typology of running walls along the ridge pretty much inform the process. If you can see the contours of that site, you kind of get a sense of how steep it is. It's a ground floor house, but from top to bottom, as it tends to fragment and find its way between the trees, bridging over the canals and the nalas, it's almost 60 feet from top to bottom. That kind of gives you a sense of the topography of the site, and that actually traces one of the nalas that runs through the house. Yeah, so that's kind of how the vocabulary developed. We worked with the local basalt masonry. We worked with composite wood and steel sections that would start to articulate the roof profiles. And it's quite interesting because as this wall kind of runs along the ridge and the private spaces start to form towards the south, and then the whole thing extends as wings out to the north and east. You can see the kind of roofs that develop there, and the tree-like systems that support it only at particular points to leave the spaces as light and open as possible, because minimal interventions in the landscape. The bridge deck that runs through one of the major streams. I'm just going to run through this. You can see the sense of excavation in those drawings. The morphology of the roof, where we start with the conventional pitched roofs if the house were at one level, and then as we simply adapt to the topography and it starts to split levels and move throughout nature, how the roofs then start to adapt. So again, the process is being flexible and I think agile in terms of adapting to the landscape and the topography. That's the smaller nala cutting through the house. That's the gigantic one along which the ridge wall runs. The roofs as they start to, and really a sense, this was I think a sense of the land really speaking to us, and it was a site that pretty much pulled the house in different directions as it just, kind of flowed down through the space. That's the major stone wall, and you can see the echoes of the forts of Tikona and Tungi in that space, both in terms of materiality and proportion. And there's a wonderful dialogue between what is extremely the sense of permanence and heaviness, and then the lightness, and then starts to emerge and weave through the landscape. I'm going to quickly run through this because Madhav is giving me intensely dirty looks. Some of these pictures are from my phone. Some of them Peter Rich took recently when he was on site. The ones with numbers are Peter's, but you can start to see the depth of the site as it starts to run through, and the nala traces, the circulation spaces. Yeah, that's Pavna Lake in the background. We got a wonderful view of it from there. Once again, the wall and the way it starts to respond to light. This was some interesting conversations with Frank Gehry's engineers who worked with us on this project, because the whole thing is done structurally in wood and steel. It's complexity in the service of honesty to the topography. It was a very, very fulfilling process, I suppose. And I guess it's just the character of the house. It's built with just 2 or 3 materials, with the local stone, the wood, and the spaces that evolved through it, this continuous sense of bridging the gap between what was found and what was made, nature finding its way through the site. And that's you can see the hills in the background. Almost there, Madhav. I can feel it. That's Peter Rich's wife sitting there in the veranda. Yeah, so just a simple, kind of structural detail where we didn't want any members to interrupt the view, so we built these cycle stand details that allowed roofs to just cantilever off a single side. And a lot of kind of devices here that I'm not going to get into right now, perhaps another forum, but I think the fact is that it's a very, very extreme site. It required a very particular, in a sense, a flexible response, and we really felt that formal strictures and frameworks and structures just completely collapse in the face of this kind of context. Yeah, that's up from the Machan. You start to see the roofs and the hills beyond. Yeah, you can see again how the topography starts to climb, and how, I guess, space and nature and built form start to fuse. That's the pool. It's actually on top of 2 bedrooms, so we could keep it away from snakes, and this is a wonderful experience of water simply disappearing into the trees. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Sorry, Madhav, my apologies, man.